Dead America. Tales from the Front Lines. The Transport. By Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0, +6. A few miles south of downtown Kansas City, Sergeant Craig yelled out as he squeezed the trigger on his assault rifle as quickly as he could. Contact rear. Contact rear. Within seconds, 2 other soldiers with him joined the assault. Private Parks and Private Hardy, both fresh out of basic and doing their best to adjust to the horrific realities of war, sent round after round down the street towards a mob of sprinting zombies that were quickly closing ground on them. Bullets ripped through the front edge of the horde that was only 30 yards away. While there were only a couple dozen of them, the speed of the creatures made them extremely dangerous. Craig picked his targets carefully, delivering kill shots with virtually every trigger pull. The 2 inexperienced soldiers beside him, however, opted for a spray and pray technique, which led to less than stellar results. For every 5 bullets they fired, 1 creature dropped to the ground. While the 3 of them fired towards the rear of their position, 2 other soldiers on the sidewalk tried to break into a storefront that was locked up tight. One worked on the lock, while the other stood guard, occasionally firing down the street in the opposite direction of the mob. It didn't take long for the sergeant to know they were about to be overrun. He turned and looked down the street, seeing a wall of flesh coming their way. Fall back. Get to the intersection. Craig fired off several more shots before smacking Parks and Hardy on the shoulder to get them to turn and move back 20 yards towards the intersection. As they got there, the sergeant looked both ways, spotting hordes of creatures in both directions. To their left, they were packed together so thick that he couldn't see more than a few yards deep into them. To their right, the creatures were spread out more. Pushing through them would be risky, but they didn't have a choice. Before they got moving, however, Craig looked back to the building, where the 2 others had either ignored the fallback order or hadn't heard it. The soldier standing guard fired rapidly towards a zombie that was bearing down on him. The man's aim was true, hitting the creature in the head and dropping it just before reaching the duo. However, there were half a dozen more ghouls just a few yards behind it. Baker, get your ass out of there. Craig raised his rifle and opened fire, hoping to buy the duo some time to escape. Despite hitting 2 of the zombies in the head and dropping them, it wasn't enough to stem the tide. Baker. Sergeant Craig watched helplessly as 2 ghouls steamrolled the young soldier, who fired wildly as he was knocked to the ground. The other soldier that was working on the door dropped his tools and drew his sidearm in a doomed attempt to defend himself. Craig could hear a couple of muffled gunshots go off as he watched the other soldier vanish underneath a pile of decaying, writhing flesh. Where in the hell are we supposed to go? Private Hardy pulled out a folded-up map, trying to figure out their location on it, but struggled to do so. I can't find where we are on here. We're on 4th and Smithfield, Parks replied. Hardy looked up from the map before tossing it over to Parks. Fantastic, you find it on here then. Parks looked down at the map, seeing the tiny print, his eyes straining to read the street names. It doesn't matter where we are on the map. If we don't get off this street, we're not going to last long, Sergeant Craig said. Sergeant Craig looked down the street towards the least of the terrible options they had. Just past the dozens of ghouls, he spotted a clearing towards the next intersection. With a decisive point towards it, he got the men ready. We have to fight our way through that. Both of the young privates turned and looked, immediately shaking their heads. I'm not so sure about that, Sarge, Parks said. What about one of these buildings? Hardy pointed to the buildings surrounding the intersection. The sergeant quickly shut that down. Because they're locked up tight, Hardy. At least that's what the recon team reported. Before Craig could continue, Parks raised his rifle and fired towards the doorway, where their 2 comrades had fallen moments earlier. Despite the rapid fire, his bullets found their mark, hitting a running zombie in the head. Those boys aren't going to be down much longer. Craig looked towards the doorway, seeing that the zombies that had been feasting on the 2 young soldiers were beginning to get up and turn their attention elsewhere. Work as a team and push your way through. And let's hope that the next block looks a little clearer. Now move. Craig slung his rifle over his shoulder before drawing his handgun and knife, prompting the other 2 soldiers to do the same. He let out a forceful grunt before breaking into a sprint, rushing down the street towards the encroaching mob. The sergeant reached the first creature, which was a few yards away from a tightly packed group. He got low, driving his shoulder into the bloody walking corpse and lifting it off the ground. With a determined shove, he sent the zombie flying through the air, landing on the pack. Parks and Hardy rushed right by him as the sergeant regained his footing. Parks raised his handgun and fired once, hitting a nearby ghoul in the face and sending it to the pavement in a heap. As he jumped over the fallen creature, Hardy got in line behind him, staying on his partner's heels. As they approached the next collection of creatures, which was a dozen strong and staggered across the street, Private Hardy grabbed onto the back of Parks' shirt before shoving him forward. The added power to the run allowed the duo to tear right through the mob, sending creatures tumbling in every direction. Seeing this, Sergeant Craig picked up the pace, rushing into the opening within the zombies before the creatures were able to regain their footing. As he reached the next clearing, he spotted rapid movement to his right. A runner broke through from a pack of zombies near the buildings, knocking them to the ground as it locked onto the sergeant. Craig attempted to raise his handgun and fire, but the ghoul was too fast. The collision was violent, the zombie slamming into the sergeant's side and sending them both to the ground. As he hit the ground, Craig lost the grip on his handgun, which clattered to rest on the pavement a few yards away. Craig managed to roll over on his back into a defensive position before the runner was able to get his bearings and launch his assault. He raised his knife as the zombie slapped down at him, the blade piercing through the palm all the way down to the hilt. Craig struggled with the flailing creature as it lunged down with its mouth. The sergeant managed to move the knife over just enough so that it embedded in the ghoul's chest, pinning its hand to the center of its body. As Craig struggled with the ghoul thrashing about on top of him, he could see out of the corner of his eye the shambling feet of dozens of undead that were making their way to him. "Damn it, this isn't how I wanted to go out," he muttered. Craig let out a frustrated scream, knowing that his moment was rapidly approaching. A split second later, however, a gunshot rang out from the side, and the head of the ghoul on top of him snapped violently to the right. The sergeant looked over and spotted Private Parks standing in the middle of the street, brandishing his handgun. "Come on, Sarge," Parks yelled out before turning and opening fire, picking off every creature he could that was getting within 5 yards of him. The sergeant wasted no time in tossing the corpse off of him and scrambling to his feet, leaving his knife and handgun behind as the mob of ghouls converged on him. He paused for a brief moment, looking back at the weapons before shaking off the idea of retrieving them and pushing forward. As he rushed towards the still firing Private Parks, Craig unslung his assault rifle, raising it up and immediately opening fire. The bullets tore through several creatures that were getting close to Parks, buying him precious seconds. It took Craig a few moments to reach the private, and as he approached, he noticed that he was alone amongst the undead. "Where the hell is Hardy?" "He's up ahead. Come on." Craig nodded as he followed Parks, the two soldiers firing a few more times to clear the path ahead of them. With a few more well-placed shots, a pathway through the shambling dead opened up, leading them straight to the intersection. There were a few scattered ghouls around, along with some corpses on the ground, but no sign of Private Hardy. "Where the hell is he?" Craig yelled. "I don't know," Parks responded. Both men looked around frantically for their comrade, as the zombies continued marching towards them from all sides. Down each side of the intersection were dozens of ghouls, all of them converging on their location. Sergeant Craig loaded a fresh magazine into his rifle, as Parks did the same for his handgun. "So what's the play, Sarge?" Parks asked. "The hell if I know, Parks. You pick the direction and we run like hell and hope for the best." Before a decision could be made, the duo heard heavy footsteps coming from their right. They turned and spotted 3 runners dressed in military fatigues sprinting towards them. Both men raised their weapons and opened fire, sending a barrage of bullets towards the sprinters. As the ghouls fell to the ground, Parks continued looking around, weighing their options, none of which were particularly good. Each direction from the intersection was packed with ghouls, dozens of them shambling in the road. "Let's go this." Parks was interrupted by a loud whistle coming from behind them. Both men turned and saw Private Hardy standing in the doorway of a 3-story building. "Get your asses over here." Parks and Craig exchanged a quick shrug before they hurried off towards their sanctuary. As they moved, Hardy fired off several shots, picking off a few straggler zombies that were a little too close to the door for his liking. A few seconds later, Craig and Parks rushed through the door, with Private Hardy grabbing and pulling it shut as soon as they were safely inside. The loud metal clang echoed throughout the empty room, and before too long, the sound of moans and decrepit hands smacking against it filled the air. Both men doubled over, panting as they struggled to catch their breath. "Are you two guys okay?" Hardy asked. Parks could only muster a thumbs up as Craig pulled himself up. "We're good, Hardy. Now where in the hell are we?" Before Hardy could respond, another voice boomed from across the room, drawing everyone's attention. "You're at 47 West, my friend." Thomas stepped out of the shadows as he spoke, his tall, muscular physique on full display in tight-fitting jeans and a t-shirt. Sergeant Craig and Parks were on edge, keeping their hands on their guns as the newcomer approached them. "Relax, my friend. You're safe here. I promise." Chapter 2. The soldiers looked upon their new host with skepticism as the banging on the exterior door continued to escalate. One particularly large clang caused Private Parks to spin around and aim his handgun towards the door. "Take it easy, soldier. Nothing is going to get through that door. It's reinforced," Thomas said. Parks looked over to Craig, who motioned for him to stand down. As they began to relax a bit, the sergeant took the lead. "You'll have to forgive us, sir. It's been a hell of a day," Sergeant Craig said. Thomas replied, "I can believe it. You boys have been shooting up the city for a couple of days now." "Trust me, it wasn't our call," Sergeant Craig responded. "I firmly believe that. If I had to guess, the people making the decisions are hiding away in some bunker," Thomas said. "More like a heavily fortified town of 100 that's miles away from anything resembling civilization. But your point is pretty spot on," Sergeant Craig added. Thomas let out a chuckle as he approached the sergeant, extending his hand for a shake. "The name's Thomas. Thomas Kincaid. I'm Sergeant Craig. This is Parks, and I believe you've already met Private Hardy over there," Sergeant Craig said. "Yes, I did. I heard the gunshots right outside the door and could see he was in a spot of trouble. So I took a chance and opened up for him," Thomas explained. "And it's a damn good thing that you did. It was starting to get rough out there," Hardy chimed in. Both of the privates flinched when the banging on the metal door intensified. Thomas motioned for them to follow him. "Come on, let's head out to the lobby to continue our conversation," Thomas suggested. The four men walked down the narrow hallway towards the door at the end. As Thomas threw it open, sunlight washed over them from the front wall of the building, which was floor-to-ceiling glass. All three soldiers immediately reached for their weapons when they saw a few dozen ghouls wandering around just on the other side of the glass, prompting Thomas to motion for them to put the guns down. "Relax, gentlemen, we're safe. Not only are the windows tinted, but they're one way," Thomas reassured them. Parks and Hardy looked over to Craig, who nodded and lowered his guard. The sergeant walked over to the glass, looking out into the streets directly at a creature that shambled by without so much as a passing glance. "You're sure about this glass not being see-through?" Sergeant Craig asked. "My accountant said the same thing when I showed him the bill for the specialized tinting, and I'll tell you what I told him. You can't put a price on privacy," Thomas responded. "Hard to argue with you there," Sergeant Craig admitted. Thomas walked around the front desk, which was made out of concrete and covered in dust. He leaned down behind it, emerging a few seconds later with several bottles of water. "Come on, you boys must be thirsty." "Dive in," Thomas offered. The three soldiers grabbed a bottle each, chugging the liquid like they had been wandering the desert for a week. "So what is this place anyway?" Sergeant Craig asked. "This is my building, 47 West, which was destined to become the highest-profile residential building in the downtown corridor. Spacious apartments, fiber optic internet, rooftop pool, world-class gym with personal trainers on standby, and a 24-hour-a-day concierge service with contacts at every restaurant and entertainment venue in town," Thomas explained. "Pretty safe to say it's out of our budget, fellas," Parks remarked. "Maybe if we pooled our paychecks together," Hardy suggested. Craig thumbed through a brochure that was laying on the counter, cracking a smile at the conversation. "We'd need half the squad to chip in, and that's a whole lot of couches. Do you really think people would have paid that much to live here?" Sergeant Craig asked. 18 of the 26 units were already pre-leased, and we were still under construction for another 2 months. By the time we opened, people would be putting their kids' names down on the waiting list, Thomas responded. Man, did I pick the wrong career? Sergeant Craig said. I thought I had the right career picked until all that bullshit outside started. Now I'm kind of regretting not opening up a grocery store, Thomas admitted. The food running a little low? Hardy asked. I've been living off of chips and crackers the last couple of days, and if you boys hadn't come along, I don't know what I was going to do, Thomas said. Thomas, I'm sorry to tell you, but we're not here to rescue you, Sergeant Craig said. Thomas stood there for a moment, staring at the sergeant incredulously. Okay, I'll admit, that stings a little, especially since you know that I'm running out of food. But if you're not here to rescue me, then what are you here to do? Thomas asked. That is an excellent question, Hardy said. Sergeant Craig let out a sigh as he walked over to a small, dust-covered seating area. The rest of the men followed him over as they all got settled in. The plan, if you could call it that, was for several teams to push forward into the heart of the city and set up a defensive position. The thinking was that if we could pull those things towards us, it would relieve the pressure on the front lines and allow them to push in against the horde, Sergeant Craig explained. As far as plans go, that one doesn't sound all that unreasonable, Thomas commented. Have you had much experience in fighting these things? Sergeant Craig asked. Just the 2 construction workers up on 3 who turned on the first day. I've been hiding in here ever since, Thomas replied. Well, no offense, but that explains why you think that was a workable plan. The problem is, those creatures are drawn to noise. We were still half a mile away from our target and had already burned through a third of our ammo. So even if we had somehow managed to get to our position, within a few hours we wouldn't have been able to make any noise, Sergeant Craig elaborated. No offense taken. And now that you spell it out, not a great plan. So what happened out there? I'm assuming that my building wasn't the target, Thomas asked. Honestly, I'm not really sure, Sergeant Craig admitted. I do. At least I think I do, Parks said. Go ahead, Parks. The floor is yours, Sergeant Craig prompted. I was only halfway paying attention to the comms because we were neck deep in those things, but I swear I heard an order come through from McKinley's team. They were a few blocks ahead of us and making the deepest push. Somebody back at command diverted them to some church that was being used as a rescue shelter, Parks explained. Jesus Christ. So they went from diversion to rescue operation on the fly, Sergeant Craig asked. I don't know, Sarge. Maybe they figured the people could help make noise, or maybe somebody with connections was trapped inside. At any rate, it doesn't really matter now because when they got there, it was a bloodbath. It's hard to describe what I heard next, but it was mainly pleading for help, Parks continued. That explains why we had so many runners out there, Hardy said. Runners? Thomas asked. Man, Thomas, you have been cooped up in here for a while, haven't you? Hardy remarked. I took out those 2 construction workers on 3, and I got my fill, Thomas replied. If someone's freshly turned, they're quick, like track meet quick. After a couple of days, though, they start shambling like our friends out there, Sergeant Craig explained. I'm tracking now. Yeah, so let's stay away from those runners, Thomas suggested. That's the plan, Hardy confirmed. My comm got busted out there. Parks, do you still have yours? Sergeant Craig asked. Private Parks nodded as he disconnected his earpiece and receiver, handing it over to the sergeant. As he got it situated, he stood up and walked over towards the front window. Excuse me for a moment, Sergeant Craig said. Take all the time you need, and if you want another water, they're behind the desk. Help yourself, Thomas offered. Craig nodded as he dialed up the proper frequency. Central Command, this is Sergeant Craig with Squad 36. Do you copy? He called out. There was a moment's pause before a soldier's voice came over the radio. Squad 36, I read you loud and clear. What's your situation? The soldier asked. Craig took a long moment to compose himself before speaking. We encountered significant resistance on the streets, including runners, mostly from the squad that was ahead of us. I believe it was McKinley's team. I don't know their number, Sergeant Craig reported. Understood. What is your current location? The soldier inquired. We're in a residential building with one civilian. The name is 47 West, Sergeant Craig informed. Stand by, the soldier said. There was a long pause as Craig could hear the shuffling of papers on the other end of the line, as if the soldier was rifling through a map. Okay, Sergeant, it would appear as though you are still a half-click away from your target. When is your ETA? The soldier asked. My squad has suffered heavy losses. There's only 3 of us left. So our ETA is never, Sergeant Craig responded. Sergeant, it is vital that you, the soldier began to say, survive. It's vital that we survive so that we can fight another day. We don't have the manpower or the firepower to push through the horde out there. Now, if you don't mind, would you start working on how we can get out of this situation? Sergeant Craig interrupted forcefully. Stand by, the soldier said again. Thank you, Sergeant Craig said. Craig let out a huff as he took a moment to gather himself. It took every fiber of his being to hold down the rage that was simmering just beneath the surface, but he knew that letting it out wouldn't help the situation. A few more long moments passed before a different person came onto the line. Captain Blake spoke with authority. This is Captain Blake. Are you still with me, Sergeant Craig? Captain Blake asked. I'm here, Captain. As I was telling the other man, there's no way that. Sergeant Craig began to explain. I don't care about your mission, son. There are more pressing matters at hand. Captain Blake interrupted forcefully, speaking with authority. I'm all ears, Captain, Sergeant Craig said. There's no good way to say this, so I'm just going to rip that Band-Aid right off. 12 teams got sent into town today. There's only 3 still standing, and none of them are intact, Captain Blake revealed. Craig began to get emotional at the thought of all those soldiers losing their lives. While their loss was bad enough, knowing that they died in pursuit of a stupid mission objective enraged him. Before speaking again, the sergeant took a few deep breaths to contain his anger. Why are you telling me this, Captain? Sergeant Craig asked. Because the plug on this operation has been pulled, Captain Blake responded. So what's the plan for evac? Sergeant Craig inquired. There isn't one, Captain Blake replied. Excuse the fuck out of me, Captain? Sergeant Craig exclaimed. I'm sorry, Sergeant, but we have no air support and our boys on the front lines are. Well, it's not good, Captain Blake explained. So what the hell are we supposed to do? Sergeant Craig asked. Off the record. If you're in a safe space, stay there, Captain Blake advised. For how long? Sergeant Craig asked. I'll be honest with you, Sergeant, it could be weeks or months. Or forever, Captain Blake admitted. And what if we're not someplace safe? Sergeant Craig asked. Give me just a second, Captain Blake responded. I got nothing but time, Sergeant Craig said. Craig could hear more shuffling of papers before the captain spoke up again. I'm sorry about the delay, Sergeant, but I had to confirm something before giving you this bit of information, which, by the way, you didn't get from me, Captain Blake said. What do you have for me, Captain? Sergeant Craig asked. At the intersection of Elm and Pine, there's an APC just waiting for someone to come and take it. Assuming I'm reading your position correctly, it's about 6 blocks from you, Captain Blake informed. That's a hell of a walk, Sergeant Craig remarked. It's better than the 60 blocks back to the front lines, Captain Blake responded. Fair enough. And if you don't mind me asking, Captain, why is there an APC just sitting in the middle of the intersection? Sergeant Craig asked. One of the scout teams got overrun. So they don't need it anymore, Captain Blake explained. Sergeant Craig let out a sigh, smacking himself on the head at his moment of stupidity. I'm sorry, Captain. I shouldn't have asked, Sergeant Craig apologized. No need to apologize, Sergeant. But if you really want to make it up to me, you can get your boys out of there safely, Captain Blake said. Copy that, Captain. And thank you, Sergeant Craig said. Don't mention it, Captain Blake replied. The line went dead as Craig turned around to the other 3 men who were still sitting on the couches enjoying their waters and shooting the breeze. "Okay, Craig, let's go ruin their day." Chapter 3. Sergeant Craig walked back to the others, carrying a stern look on his face. "That's not a fun look," Parks remarked. "How bad is it, Sarge?" Hardy inquired. "Thomas, I need you to be 100% honest with me. How much food is here?" Sergeant Craig asked, his tone serious. Thomas sighed. "There is enough to keep my belly halfway full for about 3 days. With the 4 of us, we'll be starving by this time tomorrow." "Unfortunately, that's what I thought," Sergeant Craig said, "which means we're going to have to take some risks if we want to survive this." "What kind of risks?" Parks questioned, concern evident in his voice. "There's an APC at the intersection of Elm and Pine. The previous owners are no longer with us. We're going to have to fight our way over to it," Sergeant Craig explained. "What the hell? They're not sending help?" Hardy exclaimed, disbelief etched on his face. Craig let out a sigh as he shook his head, hesitant to fill them in on just how dire their situation was. "There's no air support, and our boys on the front lines are taking it on the chin. We're going to have to do this on our own." Both privates exchanged concerning looks, while Thomas stared into the middle distance, deep in thought. After several moments, Thomas broke the silence. "You guys are taking me along with you, right?" "We weren't sent out on a rescue mission," Sergeant Craig responded. "However, if you happen to know where the corner of Elm and Pine is, you'd be a vital part of the team." 5 blocks east, 1 block north, Thomas said. "That's all I needed to hear," Craig replied. "What's the best way of getting out of here?" Parks asked, glancing towards the front windows. "The door we came in through isn't exactly an option, and the front isn't the most appealing option either." Parks motioned towards the front windows, where the streets were filled with dozens of ghouls shambling about. "There's a fire door on the west side," Thomas said. "However, it's already hooked up to the alarm. So if we go through it, we're going to be letting those things know." "We're going out the front," Sergeant Craig decided. "Those things are spread out enough that we can push through them." "You're crazy, Sarge," Hardy said, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter how we get out of this building, we're going to be fighting those things. And unless I'm mistaken, that's the direction we need to go, right, Thomas?" Craig asked. "Yep, straight down for 5 blocks, Thomas confirmed. Craig walked over to the front doors, prompting the others to get up from the couches and follow. All 4 of them stared out onto the street, mentally plotting their path through the shambling hordes of ghouls. Craig inspected the front double doors, noting that they opened inwards. He stared at them for several moments, the wheels turning in his mind as a plan began to form. "Thomas, can you fight?" Sergeant Craig asked. "I took out those 2 things up on 3, Thomas replied. "That wasn't my question," Craig said. "Yes, I can fight if I must. I have a crowbar behind the front desk," Thomas said. "Grab it because we have to move," Craig instructed. "What's the plan, Sarge?" Parks asked. "You and Hardy are going to pull these doors open as Thomas and I run through it. We're going to take care of those things right by the front, and then we're going to haul ass," Sergeant Craig explained. "Sounds like fun to me," Hardy said with a grin. "Let me get your sidearm and knife," Sergeant Craig requested. Private Hardy nodded and handed them over, even if he didn't want to give them up. He knew if he opened his mouth, Craig would most likely switch positions with him, and running headlong into a throng of creatures wasn't high up on his to-do list. "Okay, let's get this done," Sergeant Craig said. Hardy and Parks nodded as they got into position by the doors. Sergeant Craig walked back to the middle of the lobby as Thomas joined him. "Our goal isn't to kill them, it's to get them out of our way," Sergeant Craig stated. "I can work with that," Thomas replied. "Just keep your eyes out for runners and call them out if you see one," Craig advised. Thomas nodded, but Craig could notice the apprehension on his face and a slight tremble in his hands. The sergeant stepped in closer to him, getting eye to eye with him. "I need you to take a deep breath for me, Thomas," Craig said calmly. I'm fine, Thomas insisted, though his tone indicated that he was anything but fine, Just trust me, Thomas. Take a few deep breaths, Craig urged. Thomas reluctantly followed the sergeant's suggestion, taking a few deep breaths. After several of them, he began to calm down and get focused. Just stay at my side and hit them with everything you've got, and you're going to be okay, Craig reassured him. Thomas continued his deep breathing as Craig turned back to the two privates who were ready at the front doors. Hit that lock and yank those doors open on my command, Sergeant Craig ordered. Once you're through, we're right on your ass, Parks confirmed. Craig took a moment to steady himself before glancing over to Thomas, who responded with a subtle nod. Open them up, Sergeant Craig commanded. Craig and Thomas pumped their legs hard towards the set of double doors. As they got within 5 yards, the two soldiers yanked them open, clearing the path for them to rush outside. The sergeant honed in on a smaller zombie just a few yards away on the sidewalk, getting down low and planting his shoulder into the creature's gut. With a forceful scream, he managed to lift the confused and thrashing zombie off the ground. Craig took a few more steps before stopping abruptly while thrusting his arms forward, sending the ghoul flying through the air and landing on a pack of nearby creatures. Meanwhile, Thomas rushed towards the first creature he spotted, letting out a scream as he swung his crowbar towards the ghoul. The metal cracked the zombie on the side of the head, sending it to the ground in a heap. Both men turned their attention towards the street, where dozens of zombies were intently focused on them, drawn towards the noise. Keep moving, Sergeant Craig shouted. Craig and Thomas darted up the middle of the street, knocking down zombies as they went, clearing a path for the two privates to quickly catch up to them. Craig took the point as Thomas struggled with knocking down the creature in a timely fashion. The sergeant raised his handgun and popped off a handful of shots at near point-blank range, blowing the brains out of the zombies that were in his immediate path. The sergeant glanced back as he heard more gunfire going off, turning to see Parks opening fire with his handgun. This is not going well, Craig muttered to himself as he turned and continued running up the street, the rest of the men close behind. As they approached the next intersection, more creatures began flowing towards them from the side street. The path ahead was quickly closing to them as more and more creatures shambled in their direction. The gaps within their ranks were vanishing with each passing second. Craig looked around for another route, however, the side streets were just as tightly packed. Knowing that they were in a precarious position, he searched for an alternative. There was only one storefront on a corner, as the rest of the buildings were solid brick with entrances down the block. A small restaurant with floor-to-ceiling windows adorned the front. We have to get inside, Sergeant Craig shouted. Craig took off running towards the restaurant, firing off a few shots towards nearby creatures as he went. As he got within 10 yards of the storefront, he could see a throng of creatures clogging the entrance. With the number of zombies in the immediate vicinity, he knew they wouldn't have the time to unlock the door. Craig let out a frustrated scream as he fired his handgun towards one of the large windows. The bullets pierced through them, spiderwebbing the glass but not shattering it. The sergeant fired off a couple more shots, dispatching creatures that were right by the window, leaving one still standing. The zombie was a stout one, 6 feet tall with chunks of flesh missing from its muscular frame. As it took a step towards the sergeant, Craig lowered his shoulder and drove it straight into the gut of the ghoul. He managed to generate just enough force to lift the creature off its feet ever so slightly, driving it backwards into the window. With a final leap as they approached it, they both crashed through the glass, their combined weight more than enough to shatter it. They landed hard on the ground of the restaurant, knocking over a couple of tables and chairs in the process. Craig let out a huff as the wind escaped his lungs, but he quickly snapped back to the moment as the ghoul smacked its arm against his body in an attempt to grab him. Craig managed to raise his handgun, putting the barrel on the creature's forehead before pulling the trigger. The gunshot echoed throughout the restaurant, which drew the attention of the creatures at the back of the building. Craig could hear the excited moans coming from the kitchen, looking up just in time to see a trio of creatures emerging through the double doors at the back. Before he could pull himself up to his feet, a torrent of bullets ripped through them. Craig looked back to the window to see Hardy standing there with his assault rifle, popping off round after round until the threat was neutralized. As the gunfire ceased, the private jumped down, grabbing Craig by the arm and yanking him up. "Come on, Sarge, we can't stay here," Hardy urged. Craig scrambled to his feet as more gunshots went off by the window as Parks covered their retreat to the kitchen. Hardy led the way as the sergeant was still trying to get his breath back. The young private burst through the double doors, sweeping the kitchen, relieved to find it empty. He immediately rushed over to the back door, unlatching the deadbolt before pushing the door open. Immediately, several sets of rotting hands pushed through the opening, smacking against his face as he screamed out. "Oh shit," Hardy exclaimed. Thomas rushed over, swinging his crowbar down as hard as he could, the sound of breaking bones audible over the sound of excited moans. Hardy had a firm grip on the release bar of the back door, pulling it as hard as he could. However, the arms continued to prevent it from closing. Private Parks fired off a few more shots towards the front of the building before getting through the double doors. "Sarge, give me a hand with this," Parks yelled. Parks grabbed one side of a heavy metal table just off to the side of the door. Craig rushed over and grabbed the other side, both men straining as they pulled it in front of the doors. A split second later, the creatures inside the restaurant smacked up against the doors, putting enough weight behind their push to cause the table to move. Parks let out a scream as he pushed his entire body weight against it to keep the table in place. Sergeant Craig went pale as he looked around the room, seeing that both of their exits were compromised. "Sarge, what the hell are we going to do?" Chapter 4. Sergeant Craig stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, the sounds of screaming and banging filling his head to the point where no thoughts could form. After several moments, Thomas broke away from the back door, grabbing the sergeant by the shirt and shaking him forcefully. "Sergeant, you need to snap out of it right now." Thomas continued shaking the sergeant until Craig regained his focus, coming back to the moment. "I'm good, get back to the door," Craig said, his voice steadying. Thomas gave Craig a concerned look, prompting the sergeant to give him a reassuring nod. As the civilian rushed back over to the back door, Craig put his weight against the metal table to help Parks prevent the creatures from busting through. "We're not going to be able to stay here much longer, Sarge," Parks said, his voice strained with effort. "I know, I'm thinking," Craig responded, glancing around the small kitchen, hoping to find some other way of getting out. However, everything was solid. No windows, no other way of exiting. As he racked his brain for ideas, one came to him, prompting his head to drop. "I know that look. How bad of an idea is it?" Parks asked, eyeing Craig warily. Craig reached into a pocket on the side of his pants, digging around for a moment before pulling out a hand grenade. As he held it up for Parks to see, the young private let out a defeated sigh. "You are out of your goddamn mind, Sarge," Parks muttered, disbelief coloring his tone. "Do you have another idea?" Craig asked, raising an eyebrow. Parks looked towards the back door, watching as Thomas smacked at the creatures with his crowbar. His attention snapped back to the kitchen doors as another push from the other side caused the table to slide a couple of inches. "You're still out of your goddamn mind," Parks repeated, but there was a note of reluctant acceptance. "You're going to have to break away from this door at the last possible second," Craig instructed, his tone brooking no argument. "You just let me know when that pin is pulled," Parks replied, nodding. Craig nodded as he smacked Parks on the shoulder before moving to the other side of the kitchen. As he approached the back door, Thomas saw what was in his hand and reacted accordingly. "So it's come to that, has it?" Thomas asked, a grim look settling on his face. "Afraid so," Craig confirmed. Craig looked around the kitchen, spotting a small table that was against the wall. "Get that table on its side and get behind it." Thomas nodded, doing as he was told. Craig raised the hand grenade up, putting it in front of Hardy's face. After a long string of curses, Hardy spoke up. "This is going to suck," Hardy said, shaking his head. "Oh, without a doubt. When I toss this thing out, you get behind that table and be ready to open fire. Those things are going to get in here before it goes off," Craig explained. "You got it, Sarge. Just tell me when you're ready to go," Hardy replied, determination in his eyes. Craig held the grenade up, yanking the pin out of it, but holding the lever tight. The sergeant raised his voice so that Parks could hear him as well. "Here we go." Craig moved his fingers so that the lever could pop off, arming the grenade. The sergeant reached high on the side of the door, gently tossing the weapon onto the ground a few feet away from the entrance. As soon as they heard it clatter to the ground, both Craig and Hardy broke away from the door, jumping over the table and taking cover. With nobody holding onto the door, the creatures outside flung it open. As they stepped into the kitchen, Hardy opened fire with his rifle, striking a couple of them in the head. Parks kept an internal counter going in his mind, breaking away from his door just a couple of seconds before the grenade was to go off. He slid on the ground, getting behind the makeshift cover just before the detonation. The explosion was especially violent, rattling the building and ripping the door completely off its hinges. Rotting body parts flew through the air, smacking against the interior of the kitchen. The dust and debris took a moment to settle, finally allowing the men to get a view of the situation. Mangled ghouls were strewn about, several of them still attempting to move, but unable to get up due to the massive trauma they sustained. "Let's move," Craig ordered, leading the foursome out, handgun at the ready as he darted out through what was left of the doorway. The carnage in the alleyway matched that of the kitchen, with a dozen or so creatures in various states of dismemberment strewn across the ground. Craig wasted no time in sprinting down the alleyway, firing off a couple of shots as he went to clear out the last few creatures in his path. He led the group out into the street, which still had plenty of ghouls wandering about, but the commotion at the restaurant had drawn many of them over to the next street. "We're moving north," Craig shouted, leading them up the street, knocking down a few creatures as they went before making the eastward turn again. The crowd on this stretch was a little more manageable, with the zombies spread out a little more. 2 blocks up, however, the group stopped just shy of the intersection, taking refuge behind a moving truck that was lying on its side. Craig switched out his handgun for a knife, silently jamming it into a shambling creature as he moved up to the back end of the vehicle. The sergeant looked out from behind cover towards the next intersection, spotting a couple dozen creatures shambling about, completely unaware of their presence. Before breaking from cover, however, he stopped himself when he spotted a troubling sight. Craig quickly darted back behind cover, a worrying look on his face. "What is it?" Parks asked, concern etching his features. "I think it's the recon team," Craig replied, his voice low. Parks moved over a bit, looking out from cover towards the intersection. It took him a moment before spotting what the sergeant had. 5 men in bloody military clothing, the wounds on their bodies still fresh. "I count 5 of them," Parks noted, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're only 15 yards from us. There's no way we're going to be able to pick them off before they get to us," Hardy added, worry creeping into his tone. "Backtracking isn't an option, so we're going to have to figure something out," Parks said, frustration evident. As the 2 privates argued, Craig studied the overturned truck, seeing that the front end had landed on the sidewalk. There was no more than a 6-foot gap between it and the building. "We can bottleneck them here," Craig suggested. The 3 other men turned and looked at what Craig was talking about. Immediately doubt crept into their minds, but it was quickly overtaken by the realization that it was their only play. "That's still a huge opening for them to go through," Hardy pointed out. "We know they're going to have to come around that corner, and they're going to beat the slower ones to us. We're just going to have to find a way to slow them down for a few seconds in order to get a clean look at them," Craig explained. Thomas thought about it for a moment before letting out a sigh and stepping forward, lifting up his crowbar in the process. "As long as you guys can promise me that you're good shots, I can hold them up for a few seconds." "Thomas, are you sure?" Craig asked, a note of concern in his voice. "Hell no, I'm not sure. But I don't see any other way," Thomas admitted. While Thomas attempted to act tough and confident, his hands trembled so much that the soldiers wondered how he was able to keep a grip on his weapon. Before it could fall, however, Hardy stepped forward, yanking the weapon away from him. "I'll hold them at bay while you 2 get the shots off," Hardy said decisively. "Hardy, Craig began but was cut off. "Just do it, Sarge. We don't have time to debate it," Hardy insisted. Craig thought about it for a moment before nodding in agreement and motioning for the others to fall back. As they walked towards the rear of the truck, Thomas looked Hardy in the eye, giving him a thankful nod. "You're welcome. Now get back with the others," Hardy replied, a hint of a smile on his lips. Thomas did as instructed, rushing back towards the others as they readied their assault rifles. Thomas, you watch our six. We're going to be making a hell of a racket, so if something's coming our way, I want to know about it, Craig instructed. You got it, Thomas replied, positioning himself. Craig and Parks got their rifles into firing position, giving Hardy a nod that they were ready. The private gripped his crowbar tightly as he turned to get back to the front edge of the truck, muttering to himself. This is the stupidest thing you've ever done, Hardy, he muttered. The young man paused for a moment to gather himself before stepping out from behind cover. He let out a whistle and smacked the crowbar onto the ground several times, sending a metallic clang echoing through the air. All right, boys, let's get this over with, Hardy shouted. Within seconds, moans filled the air, quickly followed by the rapid footsteps of the 5 zombified members of the recon team sprinting in his direction. They moved with terrifying speed, leaving their shambling brothers and sisters in the dust as they approached the fresh prey. Hardy took a couple of steps back from the front of the truck, putting his back against the wall of the building and yelling out. Here they come, Hardy yelled, bracing himself. The first creature slammed into Hardy with tremendous force, nearly knocking the crowbar out of his hands as its chest smacked up against it. Despite the initial blow, Hardy managed to keep his footing, driving the makeshift weapon into the ghoul's torso, keeping it at bay. A second later, 2 more running ghouls emerged from behind the front of the truck and were immediately met with a torrent of bullets coming from Craig and Parks. Several of the projectiles missed their targets, however. 2 found their way into the side of the creature's skulls, ending their threat. Before the soldiers could readjust their aim, the last 2 runners emerged from behind the truck. One of them ran straight for Hardy, who was still struggling to keep the first creature off of him. The other zombie, however, turned its attention towards the trio of men at the back end of the truck. Both Parks and Craig focused their fire on the creature sprinting towards them. They were caught off guard, not expecting a zombie to come in their direction. Multiple panicked gunshots filled the air as the zombie sprinted towards the trio. Several of the shots hit the ghoul's torso or missed entirely, allowing it to close the distance in a matter of seconds. Finally, the sergeant was able to deliver a kill shot, blowing out the back of the sprinter's skull. As it fell to the ground, both men turned their attention back to Hardy, preparing to fire when they heard him scream out in pain. The second ghoul had come around the side of the creature Hardy was holding at bay, latching onto his arm and ripping out a chunk of flesh. The pain caused Hardy to lose his grip on the crowbar, allowing the first attacking creature to move in for the kill. Hardy, Craig yelled out as he rushed forward, firing his rifle repeatedly as he got closer to his man. The bullets ripped through the creatures as they munched on Hardy's flesh, each one slumping over on top of him. Craig stopped just shy of Hardy, seeing him holding his hand to a gaping neck wound that was bleeding profusely. He looked back at the sergeant, giving him a pained nod. Do it, Hardy whispered. Craig hesitated for a moment before letting out a frustrated scream as he aimed at his comrade. With a single squeeze of the trigger, Hardy was no more. Chapter 5. Craig stood a few yards away from his fallen friend. The corpses of his killers sprawled out on top of him. The sergeant remained motionless for several moments, struggling to regain his composure. As he stood there, staring at the carnage just in front of him, the moans from the mob of ghouls beckoned ever closer. Parks sprinted forward, grabbing Craig by the arm and yanking him back as the first wave of zombies shambled around the front edge of the truck. He's gone. We have to get out of here, Parks shouted, continuing to drag the sergeant along, hoping that he would snap out of it. As they got to the back of the truck, Craig finally regained his senses, spinning around and firing off several rounds into the shambling mass. The shots were poorly aimed, virtually every one of them slamming into the torsos of the creatures. As the gun clicked empty, he dropped the magazine onto the ground before slamming in another one and returning to the onslaught. Parks had finally had enough, grabbing Craig's trigger hand and pulling it free of the weapon. That's enough, Sergeant. Pull yourself together, man. We still have work to do. Craig breathed heavily, his chest heaving with rage as he stared down the private. It took him a moment to calm down, finally realizing that Parks was right. Come on, let's move. Craig snapped back into leadership mode, walking around the rear corner of the truck with the others following close behind. As they reached the other side, the sergeant motioned for them to stop and get back behind the vehicle for cover. Sarge, "We have to move," Parks urged. "In a second. They're playing follow the leader. We're about to have an opening," Sergeant Craig replied. Parks peeked around the edge of the truck, watching as the zombie conga line flowed towards the choke point they had been defending. While the back of the pack still stretched into the intersection, he could see a path around them beginning to form. Parks darted to the other side of the truck, seeing the space between the vehicle and the buildings beginning to fill up. The front edge of the creatures was only 10 yards away. However, several had tripped over each other, buying them a few precious seconds. "Let's move," Craig shouted. Craig darted out into the street with Parks and Thomas close behind. All three men pumped their legs hard, moving away from the vehicle and rushing towards the back end of the mob. Their footfalls on the pavement were heavy, echoing through the streets and drawing the attention of the nearby mob. However, the trio had more than enough speed to blow right by them. As they crossed the intersection, Craig glanced to either side, spotting dozens of ghouls spread out and shambling in their direction. To their right, he saw several zombies being shoved to the ground as two uniformed runners shoved their way through. "We have runners," Sergeant Craig shouted. The three men exerted every bit of energy they had, trying desperately to outpace the two runners. They weaved in and out through the outstretched hands of creatures, hoping that the runners would be tripped up by them. The pursuit continued down through the next block, with Craig falling a little behind the other two, constantly glancing over his shoulder to keep tabs on the sprinting dead. One of the ghouls in question did get tripped up by some of the shamblers, causing it to hit the ground. Knowing that this was his chance, Craig stopped dead in his tracks, raising his rifle while yelling out, "Get to the transport." Parks and Thomas looked back as Craig unloaded half a magazine's worth of bullets towards the runner. There were 10 yards separating the sergeant from the zombie, giving him plenty of time to land a kill shot. Bullets ripped through the zombie's torso before finding the brain, blowing it out through the back of its head. The creature managed another step before falling face first onto the pavement, skidding to a halt just a yard away from the sergeant. Craig adjusted his aim, trying to find the other runner, but couldn't get a clean shot through the throngs of creatures on the street. "Damn it," he muttered. Craig turned and continued running, pushing hard to catch up to the other two. As they ran, he continually looked over his shoulder, trying to keep tabs on the sprinter. While he never got a full look at it, he could see zombies flailing about as it ran through them. The trio got up another block, looking to the next intersection where an APC was parked in the middle of the road. A dozen zombies surrounded it, with dozens more standing in their way. "Damn it," Parks cursed, grabbing his handgun and handing it over to Thomas as they ran. "You know how to use one of those, right?" "I deal with construction contractors. Of course I know how to use one of these," Thomas replied. Thomas got the gun at the ready as the two of them rushed towards the horde surrounding the vehicle. Meanwhile, Craig spent more time looking backward than forward, trying to locate the last remaining runner. 10 yards behind him, he spotted two creatures that were shoved forward, tumbling to the ground. Craig stopped dead in his tracks, turning and opening fire before he had fully acquired the target, sending round after round downrange in the general direction of the runner. The bullets ripped through the air, some of them impacting creatures behind the area he was focused on. A second passed before the former recon soldier emerged from behind a couple of zombies, immediately soaking up the bullets. 3 of them ripped through his torso, which did nothing to slow him down. Craig continued to fire as he adjusted his aim slightly upwards, the bullet trail crawling up through the neck and face of the sprinting corpse before a round struck the ghoul on the bridge of the nose. The creature staggered for a moment before collapsing, quickly vanishing behind a sea of converging ghouls. Craig turned and pumped his legs hard towards the APC, watching as Parks and Thomas opened fire at the mob surrounding it. Several zombies shambled towards the vehicle, making them easy prey for Craig as he rushed by them and sent them to the ground with a forceful shove. As Craig got within 5 yards of the APC, the entire side of the vehicle was clear of ghouls. As he approached, the sergeant yelled out, "Parks, boost me up." Parks turned and saw the sprinting Craig closing the distance rapidly. The private immediately dropped to one knee, facing the APC and bracing himself against it. Craig rushed straight for him, planting his boot on the private's shoulder and jumping up on top of the vehicle. As soon as he landed, he spun around and extended his hand down, grabbing onto Thomas and yanking him up. "Move, Private," Sergeant Craig ordered. Parks got to his feet, reaching up as both men grabbed his arms and yanked him up to the top of the vehicle. The three of them sat there, gasping for air as they watched the mass of rotting flesh shamble towards them. Thomas began to panic as the ghouls got closer, but Craig put his hand on the man's shoulder to calm him down. "Relax, Thomas. Those things can't climb. We're safe up here," Sergeant Craig reassured him. "Did you get the runner?" "I don't see him," Parks asked. "About 30 yards back." "By that big tree there on the left," Sergeant Craig replied. Parks strained his eyes, finally locking onto the corpse on the ground. While he was relieved that the runner was dealt with, his heart ached, knowing that it was one of his brothers in arms laying face down on the pavement. "Well, I think it's safe to say that this was a next-level shit show," Parks remarked. "There's a lot of that going around lately," Sergeant Craig said. "So what do we do now?" Thomas asked. "Well, Thomas, we're going to climb into this vehicle, hope to God that it still has gas, and head back to the front lines," Sergeant Craig answered. "Then what?" Thomas inquired. "I don't have a clue. I suspect Parks and I here will get reassigned to some other outfit and sent on another mission that's doomed to fail since whoever is in charge doesn't know what in the hell they're doing," Sergeant Craig replied. "What are they doing to civilians?" Thomas asked. Craig sat there for a moment, thinking things over before responding. "I've heard stories that they're conscripting some civilians. For what kind of work, I'm not sure. If you want my advice." "Yes, please. I'll take whatever advice you can give me," Thomas said. "When you're asked where you're from, I'd pick the smallest town you can think of. That's as far away from a major city as you can get. You might be able to hitch a ride away from all this madness," Sergeant Craig suggested. Thomas thought about it for a moment as he nodded in appreciation. "Thank you, Sergeant." "Don't mention it. There's too many of us who have to deal with this waking nightmare. Sparing someone from it somehow makes me feel better," Sergeant Craig replied. "We have a bit of a drive ahead of us," Parks said. "I guess we should get to it then," Sergeant Craig agreed. Everybody nodded as they got up from their seated position. Parks walked over to the roof hatch of the APC, popping it open while keeping his hand on his weapon. He relaxed once he saw that there was nothing inside. It took them a few moments to get situated in the APC, with Craig behind the wheel. With a flick of the starter, the vehicle rumbled to life. "Okay, fellas, get comfortable, because this is going to be a bumpy ride," Sergeant Craig warned. As the two men in the back found their seats, Craig hit the gas on the vehicle. As it lurched forward, rolling over a couple of zombies with its tracks, Craig got it pointed in the right direction. With nothing but a sea of decaying flesh ahead of them, the trio pushed on towards an uncertain future. The end.